Hi everyone, and welcome to this workshop on genders and identities and sexualities. I was first asked to present this to Medway Children and Young People Services, and when I was asked to do it, they gave me the title of Gender and Identity. So I agreed and I said, but can we change this immediately? Because it's more appropriate to talk about genders and identities to make sure that people are thinking that there's more than one way of acknowledging all of this. It's really important that we talk about genders and identities. But also, I'd argue it's rather difficult to talk about these without including sexualities as well. So that's how this presentation came about. If you press the arrow key, your right arrow key, it'll move on to the next little bit of this presentation. And that's my name. So that's me, David Evans, and I'm one of the teachers in sexual health at the University of Greenwich. Press the next arrow again and you'll see some contact details. So I'd really appreciate hearing from you about this presentation, especially on Twitter. So you can see my Twitter handle there, and there's the one for our sexual health students as well. So feel free to give any feedback that you want to. Move on again, and it takes us back to these headings of gender and identity. And when you move again, it spans out to include the sexualities. So lots of people think about gender and identity, but it's really important to include sexualities as well, because they're so interrelated. When you move on to the next element, you'll see a little cartoon about the pink sheep of the family. Now, when people talk about sexualities, so often they'll think about LGBT issues. But I'd ask you to consider putting a little "and" in there. If you talk about LGBT anti, because the LGB, lesbian, gay and bisexual, are sexual orientations, whereas transgender is a gender issue. Now, sometimes you may see this list with a Q on the end, and that Q could stand for queer or questioning. So some people don't like all these different labels, so just by using the identity of queer means that they're trying to be transgressive. They want to go against being stuck into all these different labels. Or the Q, and especially for young people, could be questioning. So it may be that inside themselves they feel one way, and yet they know that the gender or sexuality cultural norms being put on them are different to how they're feeling. So it's really important that we acknowledge this and look at ways in which, even from the point of view of gender expectations, if a young child's growing up in a family, young boys are expected to do one thing, young girls are expected to do different things. They're gender expectations, and when anybody is different to those, that's where they're going to be. Well, as in this little image here, the pink sheep of the family, but not necessarily pink, whatever colour. It just means there's difference. And when you move to the next slide, you'll see how important that is, because when people are different to how they're perceived, or how they behave, or how they're considered by others, if others are expecting them then to conform to particular ways, that in itself might be a manifestation of oppression. So many people might feel oppressed because of their genders or their sexualities. Move on again and you'll see a little book, and it's called Teaching Backwards by Griffith and Burns. I'd really recommend this for any of you who are mentors or practice teachers. Now, in that book, they've got 3 little abbreviations, KWL. What knowledge have you already got on this particular subject? What more do you want to learn from this session and from your courses or programs with us? And then finally, think back on all of this. So even at the end of this session, think back and consider what you did learn. So KWL. And that's the way I'm going to process this workshop for you. And when you move on to your next slide now, you're going to see the London Child Protection Procedures, and there's a hyperlink there if you need to get that document. Because when you move to the next image, it shows you an assessment framework. Now, I presume this is being used all across London, and it may be used in other parts of the country as well, or they've got their own. But look at it in detail. Now you'll see the word identity, but there's nothing about gender and nothing about sexuality. And yet, look how gender and sexuality and identity impact not only on each other, but right across so many of these other domains shown on this diagram. Even if we just spent a few moments thinking of health, what's the differences of the impact on health because of gender? Now that's right throughout the life course. And sexualities, how may that impact? And especially on a person's mental health and well-being, if they're feeling oppressed or discriminated against because of their orientation or their gender identity, any of that is going to have an impact on their health and their well-being. So do you see what I mean? By looking at this particular document, even though it's not mentioning the two key issues we're talking about today, nevertheless they are impregnated all the way throughout this. Move on again, and your next image shows a picture of a box, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that term that we need to think outside the box. Well, for this session I would ask you to think as if the box doesn't even exist. Okay, really let your minds go with this. Try and explore things maybe as you've never done before in relation to genders and sexualities and identities, so that our discussions can be really fruitful and creative. So move on again, and that's where you'll see our intended learning outcomes for this session. So the first one is that by the end of the session, hopefully you will have thought right outside of that box and as though the box doesn't even exist. And secondly, that you'll have considered all of this in relation to the work that you're doing with children and young people. Move on again. And there's an image of you all talking. So this is where it goes over to you now. What I want to do is pose a load of questions to you. Well, not a load, just a few. I'm going to pose some questions to you, ask you to consider these. So pause this video at the moment when I ask you to. Pause the video, think about the issues, and either flip over to your Moodle site and write it in the forum button. You'll see there's a little forum discussion zone. Click onto that, click the button that says start new discussion, and even if one of you clicks onto that and then says the very first discussion, the very first question, and then you can all look in and see what each other said, press the reply button and add your own stuff to it. So although we're not in a room together at the same time, you will be in a room virtually by feeding back like this. So especially if you process it in that way, looking at one question at a time, it's going to be much easier for you to see the build up as you work through this, okay? So move on again. And you're going to see an image, I'll come back to this on 3 occasions, and it's putting children and young people at the heart of it. So that's where we've got to keep our focus. This is about children and young people. And what we're going to be looking at are genders and sexualities and identities. So move on. And there's your first question. What do you know? So you can pause this video in a moment, pause it and write down, just come out with words that you know. What do the words gender and identity say to you? Okay? So don't limit your mind thinking on this. Go as free as you can. What does gender and identity mean? Okay, once you've done that, move on to the next element that asks, what do gender and identity mean to you in relation to children and young people? Now that's really important because the way you might have considered this is just gender and identity in general, whatever those terms mean. But are there any differences then when you're thinking about this in relation to children and young people? So again, pause the video, think about this for a moment, and then give us some feedback. And when you're ready, press play again. Okay, now as you're back, you'll see that we've moved on to that same slide again. We've come back to that, putting children and young people at the heart of all of this. Move on again. And it takes you to the notion of sexuality or sexualities. So what do you understand? So again, pause the video, think about this. What do you understand by sexuality or sexualities? And now as you're back, What do you understand by sexualities in relation to gender and identity, in relation to children and young people? And pause again. And now we're back to this for the final time. So just think about this in relation to children and young people one more time. Move on again. And the next question is, what do you want to know? What more is it you want to know from this session? And not only this session, but maybe from your course as well. Have you identified that there are gaps in what you know, and that you now realise there's something more you need to get to be able to work with your children and young people better? And next, now as you're back again, what more do you want to know in relation to children and young people? So what more do you want to know about sexualities, genders and identities, but what do you want to know about those three in relation to children and young people? And now as you're back, when you move on to the next slide, you're going to see somebody saying, well, mind your own business. Now, of course, that's really important for us to consider, that some people will understand sexualities and gender identity images as something really personal and private to themselves. Some people won't want to talk about it. Now, maybe that's a cultural thing. Say, for example, particular sexual practices. There may not even be words for this in some languages. So it's going to be really important that you acknowledge that some people may not want to talk about this, and that they would find it rather difficult to do so. Okay, but also, just because they may not want to talk about it doesn't mean that they don't want to. Maybe sometimes they do want to talk about it, but maybe they haven't got the words, or maybe they're waiting for somebody else to ask them about this. So that's going to be really important for you to consider. Okay, and now as you're back again, you'll see this very black and white image. And unfortunately, that's the way that our world often thinks about genders and sexualities, in a very dyadic way. You're either one thing or the other. You're either male or female, gay or straight, young or old. All these different dyads. But of course, there's loads of different shades of grey in between all of this. And we must be able to stop putting people into pigeonholes, because once we start expecting people to behave in particular ways, then any challenge to that could often be a form of oppression if it's prejudice towards the individual. And on your next image, it's actually showing different ways in which all of these forms of oppression can be internalized by individuals. And that's really important for us to acknowledge here, that when people feel oppression from society, from culture, from their religions, from their families, if they internalize that, then that can have a negative impact on their own health and well-being, but also maybe deflect it out to others as well. So there are lots of ways in which, if a person's being bullied over particular aspects in life, it can have a negative impact on their self-esteem on the one hand. On the other hand, they may find it that if they start taking out their anger and frustration on others, then it's deflecting away from them. So this is really important, especially when you're dealing with people who are finding it difficult to come to terms with aspects of gender or sexuality identity. And here you go on the very next image, again showing stuff around identity. Look at the way in which we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us. And look again how our society in particular likes these very dyadic views of things. So where I mentioned a moment ago about young and old, straight and gay, beautiful and ugly, look what's happening here on this image. Okay, so the very fact that it's showing the way that people are and how they perceive themselves as being different, that's important as well for self-image and for self-identity. And on your next slide then, it's actually showing how all of these are interrelated, especially with issues around stigmas and stereotypes. So stigma is literally a mark or a sign. So the very fact I'm wearing glasses is a mark or a sign. But Irving Goffman back in the 50s and 60s spoke about stigma as being to do more with a discredited identity, somebody that's been labelled in negative ways. And that taps into stereotype, which means more than one of something. So the very fact that you've now met one person of one orientation, or who's told you about one particular practice, you think, oh, right, I know all about people like you. Okay? And that can tap into this prejudice then, which is prejudgment. So people have already made up their minds about all of this, and that forms then the stereotypes. Move on again. And you're going to come to an image of sexuality. Now, it's really important for us to remember that not to put people into little pigeonholes or boxes, because when we're thinking of sexualities, I'd say that there are at least these 4 dimensions that we need to consider. A person will have their own sexual orientation, and sometimes they may use a label for that. And that label may match their orientation, but not necessarily, because their attractions may be towards others that their identity label doesn't correlate with. So say, for example, if you've got young people growing up in a family where they're expected to get married to someone of the opposite gender at a particular age. So they grow up, they get married, and then maybe they're expected to have babies as well. But it could be that just because they're married, it's presumed that they're both heterosexual, and therefore the identity label is heterosexual. But their attractions may not be heterosexually inclined. And equally, their behaviours, so they may be doing things that don't conform with the identity label given them. Now that's another area then where there could be conflict, and especially with young people growing up, look at the way in which they may do things, but they want this to be hidden or covert so that others don't know. Just pause and think about that for a moment, and you will be able to read more on this from the article that's cited. And when you move on to the next area, then that's the final element of this workshop. This is asking you now to write maybe a mission statement for your place of work. So consider doing this on the course, but feel free to share all of this with your colleagues back at work. So supposing you wanted to write up a mission statement for your place of work, telling your service users how you're going to deal with genders and sexualities and identities. So you might want to come out with a mission statement that's an aim to, it's what? To do what? So that's what you need to do. So write an aim, which will be, our organisation wants to, what is it you want to do? So come out with that. Spend a few minutes working on that. Once you've written it, consider then how there may be restraining forces against this. And the restraining forces may come from the media, may come from culture, may come from parents, may come from other colleagues that you work with. Look at the ways in which people want to talk proactively and age appropriately on relationship and sexuality education in schools. And then all of a sudden you hear the negative voices saying, oh no, we shouldn't be doing this, and all the reasons why. Well, that's your restraining forces. But once you've explored those, then move on to some of the facilitating forces. And you need more facilitating forces than the restraining ones, because you have to be able to overcome these voices of erotophobia, sex negativity. So if you want to achieve an aim, come out with that aim, look at what may hinder you from achieving it, look what may enable you, and then maybe you have to retweak your aim in relation to the analysis you've just done. But please share all of that process with us online. Okay, so you might want to put the statement, well, this is what I first came out with, these were some of my restraining forces, these were some of the enabling ones, and this is how I finished it all off. And if you press your screen one more time, that's going to take you back to the main overview. So we finished. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. I'm really sorry about the technology. Something has gone massively wrong today. So I'm doing this on all different screens, hoping it's going to work for you. and I look forward to hearing what you've been saying. Okay, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.